The story of Lacey Fletcher begins quietly, in a small town in Louisiana, far from the kind of places people expect tragedy to unfold. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic phone calls, no early warnings that something deeply wrong was happening behind closed doors. That silence, in many ways, would become one of the most haunting elements of this case. Lacey Ellen Fletcher was born in the early 1990s, the only child of Clay and Sheila Fletcher. To the outside world, the family appeared unremarkable. They lived in a suburban neighborhood, held steady jobs, and kept largely to themselves. There were no criminal records, no history of violence, and no obvious signs that would have drawn attention from authorities. On the surface, they looked like an ordinary family living an ordinary life. As a child, Lacey was described as quiet and reserved. She attended school for several years, though classmates and teachers later recalled that she struggled socially and academically. Over time, it became clear that Lacey required additional support. She was eventually diagnosed with autism, a condition that affects communication, behavior, and social interaction. For some families, such a diagnosis becomes a turning point towards structured care, therapy, and professional assistance. In this case, it marked the beginning of Lacey's increasing isolation. As Lacey grew older, her presence in public life slowly disappeared. She stopped attending school. Medical appointments became infrequent and eventually non-existent. Neighbors rarely saw her outside. Friends did not visit. Family members were not known to check in. The world around the Fletcher home continued moving forward, while inside, time seemed to stall. For years, Lacey remained almost entirely confined to the house. Her parents became her sole caregivers, responsible for her health, hygiene, nutrition, and safety. That responsibility was absolute. With it came a legal and moral duty to ensure she received proper care. What would later come to light was that this duty was not simply neglected in moments of exhaustion or confusion, but abandoned entirely. On a day in early January of the year 2022, emergency services were called to the Fletcher residence. The call did not come from a hospital or a concerned neighbor, but from inside the home itself. When first responders arrived, they found a scene that would leave even seasoned professionals shaken. Lacey Fletcher was deceased. Authorities quickly determined that her death was not sudden. It was the result of long-term neglect that had unfolded over an extended period of time. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of an intruder, and no indication of a medical emergency that could not have been addressed. Instead, investigators concluded that Lacey had been left without adequate care for years. What shocked many people was not only the condition in which Lacey was found, but the fact that she had been living in the same home as her parents the entire time. This was not a case of abandonment by strangers or institutions. This was a case of neglect occurring daily, in plain sight, carried out by the very people entrusted with her life. As news of the case spread, it ignited widespread outrage. Many struggled to understand how something like this could happen in a modern society with access to health care, social services, and community support. Questions poured in from every direction. Where were the warning signs? Why did no one intervene? How did years pass without a single report? Investigators would later explain that cases of severe neglect often thrive in isolation. When a vulnerable person is hidden away from schools, doctors, neighbors, and extended family, there are fewer opportunities for intervention. Silence becomes a shield, and neglect becomes easier to conceal. The Fletcher case also raised uncomfortable questions about accountability. While neglect is often less visible than physical violence, the consequences can be just as fatal. In the eyes of the law, failing to provide basic care is not a passive act. It is a decision, repeated over time, with devastating results. As the investigation unfolded, Clay and Sheila Fletcher were arrested and charged in connection with their daughter's death. Prosecutors described the case as one of the most severe examples of neglect they had encountered. The legal process that followed would become complex and controversial, sparking debates about responsibility, mental health, and the limits of the justice system. For many observers, the most painful aspect of the case was imagining Lacey's final years, not in terms of graphic detail, but in the simple absence of dignity, comfort, and human connection. It was a life reduced to survival, without advocacy or escape. The story of Lacey Fletcher is not just a true crime case. It is a warning. It exposes the cracks in systems meant to protect the most vulnerable and challenges the assumption that family environments are always safe. It forces society to confront how easily neglect can go unnoticed when people choose not to look too closely. As Dark Psyche Case Files continues this story, the focus will remain on facts, accountability, and the broader lessons this case leaves behind. Because remembering Lacey Fletcher is not about shock value. It is about understanding how silence, isolation, and neglect can quietly become lethal. If you're finding this case as troubling as we are, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments, and hit the subscribe button to stay with Dark Psyche Case Files as we continue to examine the psychology and realities behind some of the most unsettling cases ever documented. As investigators began reconstructing the final years of Lacey Fletcher's life, a clearer picture emerged of just how completely she had been cut off from the outside world. Records showed that Lacey had not received consistent medical care for a very long time. There were no recent doctor visits, no active treatment plans, and no documentation suggesting that professionals were monitoring her condition. For someone with complex needs, this absence was alarming. Autism, particularly when combined with limited mobility and dependence on caregivers, requires ongoing support. Specialists later explained that even individuals who struggle with communication can show clear signals when something is wrong, provided someone is paying attention. In Lacey's case, there was no evidence that her parents sought help or guidance as her condition worsened. Instead, they appeared to withdraw further inward, managing everything privately, without oversight. Neighbors told authorities that the Fletcher household was unusually quiet. There were no frequent visitors, no visible signs of activity involving Lacey, and no indications that outside assistance was ever present. Over time, the lack of visibility became normalized. In many communities, privacy is respected, and without obvious disturbances, people rarely question what happens inside a home. This normalization of silence would later haunt many who lived nearby. Investigators also examined the broader social systems that typically act as safety nets. Schools, healthcare providers, and social services often serve as early warning mechanisms for neglect. When a child or dependent adult suddenly disappears from these systems, it can trigger concern. In this case, however, Lacey's gradual withdrawal meant there was no single moment that raised alarms. Her absence became permanent without ever being formally questioned. As law enforcement continued their inquiry, they interviewed Clay and Sheila Fletcher extensively. Their accounts of daily life raised serious red flags. According to investigators, the parents acknowledged that Lacey spent the majority of her time in the living room, with little variation in routine. There was no explanation that justified the level of neglect authorities believed had taken place. What stood out most was not confusion or panic, but a disturbing acceptance of conditions that should never have been tolerated. Medical examiners later confirmed that Lacey's death was the result of prolonged neglect rather than a sudden medical event. This conclusion was critical. It meant that her passing was not unavoidable or unpredictable. It was the outcome of repeated failures to act. From a legal standpoint, this distinction mattered greatly. Neglect cases often hinge on intent and awareness. Prosecutors argued that Lacey's parents were fully aware of her condition and her dependence on them. They had the means to seek help and chose not to. In the eyes of the law, that choice carried consequences. When charges were formally announced, Public reaction was swift and emotional. Many people expressed disbelief that parents could allow such conditions to persist. Others struggled with the uncomfortable truth that severe neglect does not always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it hides behind closed doors, sustained by routine and denial. The case also reignited discussions about caregiver burnout and mental health. Some questioned whether Lacey's parents were overwhelmed or incapable of providing proper care. Experts weighed in, clarifying that while caregiving can be exhausting and emotionally taxing, it does not excuse total abandonment of responsibility. Support systems exist precisely to prevent such outcomes, but they must be accessed. As court proceedings moved forward, the case became more than a local tragedy. It became a national conversation about invisible victims and the limits of trust placed in family units. Advocacy groups emphasize that vulnerable adults are often overlooked, especially when they age out of child protection systems. Without consistent monitoring, they can disappear entirely. For many following the case, the most unsettling realization was how ordinary everything seemed until it was too late. There were no dramatic escapes, no cries for help that reached authorities, and no intervention until Lacey's life had already ended. It was a reminder that neglect does not announce itself loudly. It often whispers, waiting for someone to listen. As Dark Psyche Case Files continues to examine this case, the focus remains on understanding how multiple failures intersected to create an environment where neglect could persist unchecked. Because learning from cases like this is one of the few ways to prevent history from repeating itself. If this case is raising difficult questions for you, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and hit the subscribe button to support Dark Psyche Case Files as we continue exploring the psychology behind real cases that challenge our assumptions about safety and care. As the legal process moved forward, attention shifted from the immediate facts of Lacey Fletcher's death to the broader question of responsibility. Prosecutors began assembling a timeline that showed not just what happened in the final days, but what failed to happen over many years. Each missed medical appointment, each absence from public life, and each decision to remain isolated formed a pattern that investigators described as systematic neglect. Court documents revealed that Lacey had been entirely dependent on her parents for care well into adulthood. She did not have the ability to advocate for herself, make medical decisions, or seek help independently. This level of dependence placed an extraordinary obligation on her caregivers. In the eyes of the law, that obligation did not diminish with time. If anything, it grew more urgent. During pretrial hearings, experts in caregiving and disability support were consulted to provide context. They explained that long-term care requires planning, adaptation, and outside assistance. When a caregiver becomes overwhelmed, the responsible course of action is to seek help, not to withdraw. Resources such as medical professionals, social workers, and support organizations exist specifically to prevent neglect from escalating into tragedy. Prosecutors argued that the Fletcher case was not about a lack of resources, but a refusal to use them. There was no evidence that Lacey's parents attempted to contact social services, disability advocacy groups, or healthcare providers in her later years. This absence of action became a central element of the state's case. Public reaction continued to intensify as more details emerged. Many people expressed anger not only at the parents, but at the systems that failed to notice Lacey's disappearance from public life. Online discussions questioned whether neighbors, extended family members, or community institutions could have intervened sooner. Others cautioned against oversimplification, noting that privacy laws and social norms often limit outside involvement unless clear warning signs are present. The case also highlighted a difficult reality. Neglect cases are often harder to detect and prosecute than cases involving direct violence. There are no witnesses to a single act, no dramatic moment that signals a crime. Instead, there is a slow accumulation of inaction. Each day without care becomes part of the harm. As court proceedings continued, Clay and Sheila Fletcher faced intense scrutiny. Their defense raised questions about mental health, stress, and isolation, suggesting that the situation was more complex than it appeared. Prosecutors countered that complexity does not erase accountability. They emphasized that awareness without action still constitutes neglect. For many observers, this legal debate underscored a troubling truth. Society often assumes that families will act in the best interest of their loved ones, especially when disability is involved. When that assumption proves false, the consequences can be devastating. Lacey Fletcher's case forced a reevaluation of how much oversight exists for vulnerable adults living at home. Advocates used the case to call for stronger monitoring systems and clearer pathways for intervention. They argued that adults with significant disabilities should not vanish from public records without follow-up. Regular wellness checks, accessible reporting mechanisms, and community education were all proposed as ways to prevent similar outcomes in the future. Throughout the proceedings, Lacey herself remained at the center of the conversation, even as she was no longer able to speak. Prosecutors repeatedly reminded the court that this case was not about abstract failures or legal technicalities. It was about a person whose life had narrowed until there was no one left to intervene. As Dark Psyche Case Files examines this chapter of the story, it becomes clear that Lacey Fletcher's death was not the result of a single bad decision. It was the culmination of years of silence, isolation, and missed opportunities for help. Understanding that progression is essential, not only for justice, but for prevention. If this case is making you reflect on how vulnerable people can be overlooked, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and hit the subscribe button to stay connected with Dark Psyche Case Files as we continue this important discussion. As the case moved closer to resolution, attention turned to how the justice system would ultimately respond to what had happened to Lacey Fletcher. By this stage, the facts were no longer in dispute. Authorities had established that Lacey's death resulted from prolonged neglect and that her parents had been her sole caregivers during that time. What remained was the difficult task of determining accountability within the boundaries of the law. Legal analysts following the case explained that neglect cases often present unique challenges. Unlike crimes involving sudden acts of violence, neglect unfolds gradually. There is no single moment that defines the crime. Instead, responsibility is built day by day, through repeated failures to act. Prosecutors emphasized that this slow progression did not lessen the severity of the outcome. If anything, it demonstrated how sustained neglect can be just as destructive as any overt act. In court, arguments focused heavily on awareness and capability. The prosecution maintained that Clay and Sheila Fletcher were fully aware of their daughter's dependence on them and understood her inability to care for herself. They argued that the parents were not isolated from society, nor were they prevented from seeking help. Medical care, social services, and disability support systems were available to them. Choosing not to engage with those systems was presented as a conscious decision. The defense, on the other hand, pointed to emotional strain and isolation, suggesting that the situation had deteriorated gradually and without malicious intent. This argument sparked intense public debate. Many questioned whether intent should matter when the outcome was so severe. Others argued that understanding caregiver stress was necessary to prevent future tragedies. What remained clear was that the law ultimately measures actions and consequences, not just intentions. As hearings progressed, the case drew renewed attention to how society treats vulnerable adults. Advocates highlighted that once individuals age out of child protection systems, oversight often becomes limited. Adults with disabilities may rely entirely on family members, with little external monitoring. In Lacey's case, this lack of oversight allowed years to pass without intervention. Media coverage remained extensive, but there was a noticeable shift in tone. Early shock gave way to reflection. Commentators began asking not only how this happened, but how many similar situations might exist undetected. The Fletcher case became a symbol of hidden neglect, reminding the public that harm does not always leave visible marks until it is too late. Community members near the Fletcher home also grappled with guilt and confusion. Some neighbors stated that they assumed privacy and did not feel it was their place to question what happened behind closed doors. Others wondered whether signs had been missed or dismissed. These reflections underscored a broader social dilemma, balancing respect for privacy with responsibility for one another. Throughout this phase of the case, Lacey's name remained central. Advocates stressed the importance of remembering her not only as a victim, but as a person whose life had value. They emphasized that dignity, care, and attention are basic human rights, not privileges granted only when circumstances are convenient. As the legal process neared its conclusion, the case left behind more than court records. It left behind difficult lessons about silence, responsibility, and the consequences of inaction. It challenged assumptions about safety within family homes and exposed the vulnerabilities that exist when care is left entirely unmonitored. For Dark Psyche Case Files, this chapter represents a turning point. It is where the focus shifts from what happened to why it matters. Because understanding the systems and decisions that failed Lacey Fletcher is essential if similar tragedies are to be prevented. If this case is making you think about the responsibilities we hold toward vulnerable people in our communities, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and hit the subscribe button to support Dark Psyche Case Files as we continue this final chapter. As the case of Lacey Fletcher reached its final stage, what remained was not shock but reflection. By this point, the facts had been examined, the legal arguments heard, and the public conversation fully ignited. Yet no verdict, statement, or headline could undo what had already happened. Lacey's life had ended quietly, and the world only noticed when it was too late. In the aftermath, many struggled with a sense of collective failure. The justice system addressed accountability, but responsibility felt broader than any courtroom decision. This case forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth. Neglect does not always come from cruelty alone. Sometimes it comes from withdrawal, denial, and a refusal to engage with help that exists. Experts who later analyzed the case emphasized that severe neglect rarely begins suddenly. It develops gradually, normalized over time until unacceptable conditions feel routine. Each day without intervention lowers expectations, making it easier for caregivers to convince themselves that what is happening is manageable or temporary or unavoidable. In Lacey's case, that normalization proved fatal. Advocacy groups used her story to push for stronger protection for dependent adults. They stressed the importance of regular welfare checks, improved reporting systems, and better education for communities on recognizing signs of neglect. The goal was not to assign blame indiscriminately, but to ensure that vulnerable individuals are not allowed to disappear from view without follow-up. The case also sparked renewed discussion about autonomy and oversight. While independence and privacy are fundamental rights, they can become dangerous shields when someone is unable to advocate for themselves. Lacey Fletcher's life demonstrated how easily vulnerability can be hidden behind closed doors, especially when there is unquestioned trust in family structures. For many who followed the case closely, the most painful realization was how ordinary everything seemed before the tragedy was discovered. There were no dramatic warnings, no urgent pleas that reached authorities, just years of silence, slowly accumulating into irreversible harm. It served as a reminder that the absence of noise does not mean the absence of suffering. In remembering Lacey, advocates emphasized the importance of seeing beyond diagnoses and limitations. She was not defined solely by her disability or by the way her life ended. She was a person who depended on others for care, dignity, and protection. Those needs were not extraordinary. They were basic. The legacy of this case lies not only in legal records, but in the questions it leaves behind. How many others live unseen in similar conditions? How many warning signs go unnoticed because discomfort discourages inquiry? And how can communities balance respect for privacy with responsibility for human life? For Dark Psyche Case Files, this story stands as a solemn reminder of why these cases matter, not for outrage or spectacle, but for awareness. Because understanding how neglect unfolds is one of the most powerful tools for prevention. If this case moved you, disturbed you, or made you reflect, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps Dark Psyche Case Files continue shedding light on stories that demand accountability, empathy, and change.